The voicemail arrived at 3:47 p.m. on December 23rd, just as I was pulling my grandmother's china from the cabinet, each delicate plate wrapped in tissue paper like a precious memory. My daughter-in-law's voice came through the speaker with that particular tone she used when delivering news she knew would sting. "Hi, Margaret. So we've decided to keep Christmas dinner really small this year, just immediate family. I hope you understand. We'll call you later in the week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I stood there in my kitchen, holding a porcelain plate painted with tiny roses, listening to those words echo in the sudden silence. Just immediate family. After 43 years of hosting Christmas dinner in this very house, after 31 years of welcoming her into our traditions, I was no longer considered immediate family. The plate trembled in my hands as the weight of it settled over me. Not anger, not yet. Just a hollow, breathless feeling like someone had carefully extracted something vital from my chest and walked away with it. I set the plate down with the kind of care you use when your hands might betray you, when the smallest movement could shatter something irreplaceable. Through the kitchen window, I could see the Christmas lights my late husband Thomas had strung along the fence 20 years ago, the same lights I'd been plugging in every December since he passed. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was decorating for a holiday I was apparently no longer invited to celebrate. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, and I turned 72 last October in this same kitchen, surrounded by my son David, his wife Jennifer, and my 3 grandchildren. We'd eaten chocolate cake with buttercream frosting, the kind I'd been making for family birthdays since David was 7 years old. Jennifer had even complimented the frosting, said it was better than the bakery. I'd given her the recipe that night, written it out on one of my good note cards in my careful handwriting. Now, 2 months later, I was learning that 43 years of Whitmore family Christmas traditions were being quietly erased, and I was the only one who hadn't received the memo. I walked slowly to the living room where the Christmas tree stood, in its usual corner by the bay window. Thomas and I had picked that spot our first Christmas in this house because the lights would shine through to the street, welcoming anyone who passed by. We'd been 28 and 29 then, young and foolish enough to believe that love and good intentions were enough to build a life on. We'd been right, mostly. The tree was smaller this year. At my age, wrestling with a 7-foot Douglas, fur seemed less charming and more like a conversation with the emergency room. But I'd still driven out to Peterson's tree farm like I had every year since 1981. Still spent 20 minutes walking between the rows until I found the right one. This year's tree was a modest 5-footer with a slight lean to the left and a bare patch near the bottom that I'd turned toward the wall. The ornaments hung exactly where they always had. The angel Thomas had surprised me with on our second Christmas together still crowned the top. Her white dress slightly yellowed now, but her gold halo catching the light just the same. Beneath her hung 43 years of memories. David's handprint in clay from kindergarten, his school photo ornaments showing the gap-toothed progression from 5 to 18, the ceramic snowman Jennifer had given me the first Christmas after she and David got engaged. I remembered that Christmas clearly because it was the first time I'd felt like our family was growing instead of staying the same. Jennifer had been nervous, fidgeting with her earrings during dinner, asking if she could help with dessert 3 times, even though everything was already prepared. After we'd opened presents, she'd pulled me aside in the kitchen and said she hoped I didn't mind that she'd gotten me something personal. The snowman ornament was painted with Margaret and Jennifer, Christmas 1999 in careful script around the bow base. "I wanted you to know how grateful I am," she'd said, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "For raising such a wonderful man, and for making me feel like I belonged here from day one." I'd hugged her then, this young woman who was still learning how to be part of our family, and told her what I believed with my whole heart. "This is your home too, sweetheart. It always will be." Standing in front of the tree now, that ornament seemed to mock me. Margaret and Jennifer. as if we'd ever been equals in this family equation. As if I'd ever been anything more than a placeholder until she felt confident enough to take over. The house around me felt enormous and cramped at the same time. Every room held memories of Christmas mornings, of grandchildren racing down these stairs in their pajamas, of Jennifer learning to make my sweet potato casserole, of David carving turkey at the dining room table just like his father used to do. This house had been the center of our family's orbit for over 4 decades, the place everyone came home to, the keeper of our traditions. Now it was just a house where an old woman lived alone with her cat and her increasingly irrelevant memories. I picked up my phone and scrolled to David's number, then set it down without calling. What would I say? That his wife's voicemail had broken something in me I wasn't sure could be fixed? That I was sitting in a house full of Christmas decorations, surrounded by evidence of a family that no longer seemed to include me? That I'd spent the morning polishing silver that would never again hold Christmas dinner for the people I loved most? The smart thing, the dignified thing, would be to call back and say I understood completely, that I hoped they had a wonderful time, that maybe I'd see them for New Year's or Easter, or whenever it was convenient for them to remember I existed. But I didn't feel smart or dignified. I felt erased. The afternoon stretched ahead of me like a question I didn't know how to answer. I'd planned to spend it preparing for a dinner that was no longer happening, following traditions that were, apparently, no longer mine to keep. The turkey I'd ordered from Miller's Market was still in the refrigerator, a 12-pound reminder of expectations that would never be met. The cranberry sauce was already made, sitting in my good crystal bowl. The dining room table was set for 8, complete with the cloth napkins I'd pressed yesterday and the silver candlesticks Thomas had inherited from his mother. I walked into the dining room and looked at that table, perfectly arranged for a celebration that would never happen. 8 place settings, 8 careful arrangements of china and crystal and silver, 8 chairs waiting for family members who would be gathering somewhere else, around someone else's table, making memories I wouldn't be part of. The sight of it was suddenly unbearable. I began clearing the table with methodical precision, folding each napkin and stacking each plate with the kind of care that borders on ritual. This was how you dismantled a life, I realized. Not with dramatic gestures or heated arguments, but with quiet, careful movements that erased hope one piece at a time. When the table was bare, I stood looking at its polished surface and saw my reflection staring back, distorted and wavering like something seen through water. The woman in that reflection looked older than 72, smaller somehow, as if she'd been wearing clothes that were too big for her and had only just noticed. I thought about calling my sister Ruth in Phoenix, or my college friend Barbara who'd moved to Florida after her husband died. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But what would I tell them? That my family had decided I was no longer necessary for their happiness? That I'd become the kind of relative you tolerate rather than celebrate? The shame of it felt worse than the loneliness. Instead, I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea in the good china, the kind I usually saved for company. If I was going to be alone in my own house during the Christmas season, I might as well do it properly. I chose the cup with the blue roses, the one Thomas used to say matched my eyes, and I sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten thousands of meals over the decades. The silence was different now than it had been that morning. Before the voicemail, it had been the comfortable quiet of anticipation, of a house holding its breath before a celebration. Now it felt like the silence of abandonment, of spaces too large for the people left to fill them. I thought about the Christmases of my childhood, when my mother would spend days preparing for family gatherings that sometimes included 20 people or more. My aunts and uncles, my grandparents, cousins whose names I struggled to remember, neighbors who'd become honorary family over the years. The house would burst with noise and laughter and the kind of chaos that comes from too many people trying to help in one kitchen. My mother had died when I was 45, too young to understand that someday I might be sitting in my own kitchen, wondering when I'd stopped being essential to the people I'd given my life to raise and love. The phone rang while I was finishing my tea, and for a moment my heart lifted with the possibility that David had called to fix this, to tell me there'd been some misunderstanding. But the caller ID showed my neighbor Helen's number, and when I answered, her cheerful voice filled the kitchen. "Margaret, I was just wondering if you needed any last-minute help with tomorrow's dinner. I know how much work you put into those Christmas feasts of yours." Helen had been my neighbor for 15 years, ever since she and her husband moved into the colonial next door. She was one of those perpetually optimistic women who baked cookies for the mailman and remembered everyone's birthday. Under normal circumstances, her kindness was a gift. Today it felt like salt in a wound I was still learning to acknowledge. "Actually, Helen, there's been a change of plans," I heard myself say, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. "The family decided to host dinner elsewhere this year." "Oh." The pause that followed was heavy with unasked questions. "Well, that's nice for you, I suppose. A break from all that cooking and cleaning. You'll be going to David's house then?" Something like that. I hung up before she could ask more questions, before I had to explain that I wasn't going anywhere, that Christmas this year would be a day like any other day, except quieter and filled with the echo of traditions that no longer belonged to. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of small, purposeless tasks. I watered the poinsettias on the windowsill, checked the thermostat twice, reorganized the spice cabinet for no reason except to keep my hands busy. I avoided looking at the refrigerator, where the turkey sat like an accusation, and I definitely avoided looking at the stack of wrapped presents in the hall closet, gifts I'd spent weeks selecting and wrapping for grandchildren who might not think of me at all tomorrow. As evening approached, I found myself standing in the bathroom, looking at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. When had my hair gotten so thin? When had these lines around my eyes deepened from laugh lines into something that looked more like grief? I'd always prided myself on aging gracefully, on being the kind of woman who embraced each decade with dignity and humor. But the woman in the mirror looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I thought about Thomas then. Really thought about him for the first time in months. Not the careful, curated memories I usually allowed myself, but the real Thomas who used to find me in the kitchen after dinner and dance with me while the dishes soaked in soapy water. The Thomas who would have known exactly what to say about this situation, who would have made me laugh until the hurt feelings transformed into something manageable. "What would you do, Tommy?" I asked the empty bathroom, using the nickname I'd called him when we were alone together. "How do you handle it when the family you built decides they don't need you anymore?" But Thomas had been gone for 8 years, and the silence that answered me was absolute. I made myself a simple dinner of soup and toast, eating at the kitchen table while the Christmas lights outside my window twinkled with false cheer. Neighbors walked by with their dogs, their breath visible in the cold air, their movements quick and purposeful as they hurried toward whatever warm homes and waiting families they had to return to. After dinner, I sat in Thomas's old chair in the living room and tried to read, but the words kept blurring together. I turned on the television and flipped through channels full of Christmas movies and holiday specials, all of them featuring families gathering around tables, all of them reminding me of what I would be missing tomorrow. Finally, I turned everything off and sat in the semi-darkness, with only the Christmas tree lights providing any illumination. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds of an old building making itself comfortable for the night. But tonight, those sounds seemed lonely rather than comforting, like the house itself was wondering where everyone had gone. I thought about the last Christmas we'd all been together, just 10 months ago. It had been one of our best, actually. Jennifer had seemed relaxed and happy, helping me in the kitchen without the tension that sometimes marked our interactions. David had been more present than usual, putting his phone away during dinner and really talking to his children instead of just managing them. The grandchildren had been old enough to appreciate the traditions, to to understand that Christmas at Grandma's house was special, different from the casual celebrations they might have elsewhere. After dinner, we'd all gathered in the living room for the traditional reading of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," a tradition Thomas had started when David was small. I'd taken over the reading after Thomas died, and last year, my youngest grandson had asked if he could help. We'd read it together, his small finger following along with the words, his voice stumbling over the harder parts but his face glowing with pride at being chosen for such an important job. Had there been signs, then, that this Christmas would be different? Had I missed something, some subtle shift in the family dynamic that should have warned me? I replayed conversations and glances, looking for clues I might have overlooked, but found nothing definitive. Just the gradual sense that I'd become more peripheral to their lives, more of an obligation than a joy. The realization hit me then, with surprising clarity. I'd been managing this relationship for years, doing most of the work to maintain connections, to create opportunities for togetherness, to preserve traditions that apparently mattered more to me than to anyone else. I was the one who called to check in, who remembered birthdays and school events, who suggested family dinners and holiday gatherings. I was the one who bent my schedule around theirs, who accommodated last-minute changes and conflicting priorities. When had I become the one chasing after their attention instead of being sought out for my company? The answer was uncomfortable but undeniable. Gradually, so gradually that I'd convinced myself it was natural. The normal evolution of family. Relationships as children grew into adults with lives and responsibilities of their own. I told myself that being less central to their daily lives was healthy, that good parents raised children who could function independently. But there was a difference between independence and dismissal, between growing up and growing away. And sitting alone in my decorated house on the night before Christmas, I was finally forced to acknowledge which category my relationship with my family had fallen into. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, each note hanging in the air like a small goodbye. I should go to bed, I knew. Tomorrow would be difficult enough without the added burden of exhaustion. But I found myself reluctant to end this day, to officially begin the first Christmas of my adult life that I would spend entirely alone. Instead, I stayed in Thomas's chair, watching the tree lights blink in their endless pattern, thinking about all the Christmases that had come before and wondering if there would be any more that included the sound of children's laughter echoing through these rooms. The thought that this might be my new normal, holidays spent in solitude, traditions practiced for an audience of one, settled over me like snow, silent and cold and transformative. Everything looked the same, but underneath, the landscape had changed completely. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like, but all I could summon was the echo of Jennifer's voice on that voicemail, cheerfully erasing me from the family's future with the kind of casual efficiency usually reserved for updating grocery lists. "Just immediate family," she'd said, as if I'd never been anything more than an extended relation, someone you invite out of politeness rather than love. The Christmas tree lights continued their silent dance, illuminating a room full of memories, and traditions that tomorrow would feel more like museum pieces than living celebrations. And for the first time since Thomas died, I felt truly alone in the world, surrounded by the life I'd built, but no longer sure who it belonged to. I woke on Christmas Eve morning to the sound of ice pelting against my bedroom windows. The weather had turned overnight, transforming what should have been a picturesque Christmas into something gray and forbidding. Through the frost-covered glass, I could see my neighbors' houses beginning to show signs of holiday life. Warm lights in kitchen windows, the occasional figure moving past a curtain, the early stirrings of families preparing for their celebrations. My house remained, still and quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I lay in bed longer than usual, postponing the moment when I would have to decide what to do with this day that stretched ahead of me like an empty page. For the past month, Christmas Eve had meant something specific. Last-minute preparations, the careful arrangement of presents under the tree, the anticipation of tomorrow's gathering. Now it meant nothing except the passage of time. But lying there in the growing daylight, I found my mind drifting back to other Christmas Eves, to the years when this day hummed with purpose and joy. I let myself remember, really remember, for the first time in months. There was the Christmas Eve when David was 8 and had convinced himself that if he stayed awake all night, he could catch Santa Claus in the act. Thomas and I had taken turns checking on him, finding him with his eyes squeezed shut, pretending to sleep but clearly wide awake with excitement. Finally, around midnight, Thomas had crept into his room with a half-eaten cookie and a glass with just a swallow of milk left in it, leaving them on the nightstand where David would find them in the morning. The next day, David had been absolutely convinced he'd heard reindeer on the roof, and his certainty had been so complete, so joyful, that even I had almost believed it myself. There was the Christmas Eve when David was 16 and thought he was too cool for family traditions, until a snowstorm knocked out the power and we'd spent the evening playing board games by candlelight. By the end of the night, he was laughing so hard at Thomas's terrible Monopoly strategy that he nearly fell off his chair. That was the Christmas he'd asked me if we could play games like that more often, even when the power was working. There was the Christmas Eve 10 years ago, when Jennifer had just learned she was pregnant with their third child, but hadn't told anyone yet. I'd noticed her turning down wine and pushing her food around her plate, and when I'd caught her eye across the dinner table, she'd given me a small, secret smile that I'd understood immediately. Later, washing dishes in the kitchen, she'd whispered the news to me before even David knew, asking if I thought he'd be happy about another baby. I'd hugged her with wet, soapy hands and told her that babies were always a blessing, especially in families that knew how to love them properly. Those memories felt both precious and painful now, like photographs of a country I could never visit again. They belonged to a version of my family that had existed once, but had somehow transformed into something I no longer recognized. The people in those memories, David who'd sought my approval, Jennifer who'd trusted me with her secrets, felt like characters from a story rather than real people I could call on the phone. I forced myself out of bed and into the kitchen, where the sight of the turkey still sitting in the refrigerator was like a small slap. 12 pounds of organic, free-range accusation, ordered 3 weeks ago when I still believed I would be hosting Christmas dinner. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to decide what to do with it. Throwing it away seemed wasteful, but keeping it felt masochistic. In the end, I left it where it was and made myself coffee in one of my everyday mugs, not the good china. Today didn't feel like a good china kind of day. The phone rang while I was standing at the kitchen sink, watching the ice accumulate on the bare branches of the oak tree in my backyard. For a moment, my heart did that familiar leap of hope. Maybe it was David, calling to invite me over to tell me there had been some misunderstanding, but the caller ID showed my sister Ruth's name, and I almost didn't answer. Ruth had a way of asking questions I wasn't prepared to answer, and today I felt particularly fragile. "Merry Christmas Eve, Maggie." Ruth's voice was warm and familiar, using the nickname she'd called me since we were children. "I know you're probably up to your elbows in preparation, but I wanted to call before things got too crazy over there." I closed my eyes, grateful she couldn't see my face. Ruth lived in Phoenix now, had moved there after her retirement, and we talked every few weeks but rarely about anything deeper than the weather or her volunteer work at the animal shelter. She had her own life, her own routines, and I'd never wanted to burden her with my problems. "Hi, Ruth. Merry Christmas Eve to you too. So tell me, how many are you feeding tomorrow? I know David's crew keeps growing, and didn't Jennifer's parents move closer last year?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could lie, could pretend everything was normal, could protect Ruth from the uncomfortable truth of my situation. Or I could tell her the truth and risk the pity I wasn't sure I could handle. "Actually, things are different this year," I heard myself say. "The family decided to have Christmas dinner at David and Jennifer's house instead." "Oh." Ruth's Pause was brief but loaded. Well, that's probably easier for you, isn't it? All that cooking and cleaning, it's a lot of work for one person. Yes, I agreed, though my throat felt tight. It's probably time. So what time do you need to be there? Do you want me to call you later, or will you be too busy with family time? The lies I could have told lined up in my mind like dominoes. I could have said I was expected at 2 o'clock, that I was bringing dessert, that the grandchildren were excited about presents. I could have preserved the fiction that I was still an integral part of my son's family, still necessary to their happiness. Instead, I found myself telling Ruth the truth. Not all of it, not the part about the voicemail or the way I'd felt erased from my own family's story, but enough. I'm not going, actually. Jennifer said they wanted to keep it small this year. Just immediate family. The silence that followed was longer and heavier than I'd expected. When Ruth spoke again, her voice had changed, become sharper and more focused. Just immediate family? Maggie, you're David's mother. You're as immediate as family gets. I know, but things change, people grow up, start their own traditions. That's nonsense, and you know it. Ruth's voice had taken on the tone she'd used when we were children, and she was preparing to fight someone who had wronged me. What did David say when Jennifer told him this brilliant plan? I don't know. I haven't talked to David. You haven't talked to him. Maggie, this is ridiculous. Call him right now. But I couldn't call him, couldn't face the possibility that he knew about this plan and had agreed to it, that his silence wasn't ignorance but consent. The thought of hearing him try to explain why excluding his mother from Christmas dinner was reasonable, necessary, even kind, was more than I could bear. Ruth, I'm tired. I don't want to fight about this. You don't want to fight about being excluded from your own family's Christmas? What's wrong with this picture? Everything. I thought, but didn't say. Everything was wrong with this picture. After Ruth hung up, promising to call back later and making vague threats about calling David herself, I sat in my kitchen feeling more isolated than before. Ruth's outrage, while comforting in its way, only highlighted how abnormal my situation really was. Other people's families didn't exclude elderly mothers from holiday celebrations. Other people's daughters-in-law didn't leave voicemails casually erasing decades of tradition. I thought about the early years with Jennifer, when she'd been so eager to please, so grateful to be welcomed into our family. She'd been 26 when she and David got engaged, a serious young woman with dark hair and an MBA who worked long hours at a consulting firm downtown. She'd grown up in a military family that moved frequently, never staying anywhere long enough to develop deep roots or lasting traditions. When David brought her home for the first time, she'd been almost shy in her appreciation of our family dinners, our photo albums, our easy familiarity with each other. I've never had this, she'd told me once, early in their relationship, as we'd stood together in my kitchen after Sunday dinner. A family that actually likes spending time together, that has inside jokes and traditions that go back years. David's so lucky. I'd been touched by her honesty, by the wistfulness in her voice. I'd wanted to tell her that she would have it. Too now, that being part of our family meant inheriting all of our history and all of our future celebrations. And for years, it had seemed like she understood that, like she valued being a Whitmore as much as we valued having her. When had that changed? When had she stopped seeing our traditions as gifts and started seeing them as obligations? When had she stopped feeling grateful for inclusion and started feeling burdened by expectation? The shift had been so gradual that I'd missed it entirely. Looking back now, I could see small signs that I'd dismissed at the time. The way she'd started suggesting restaurants instead of family dinners at my house. The way she'd begun making her own plans for holidays and then inviting us to join them, rather than assuming we'd all gather at the family home as we always had. The way she'd stopped asking for my recipes and started talking about catering services and meal delivery kits. But I'd attributed all of that to her busy schedule, her demanding career, the natural evolution of a young family creating their own routines. I'd been proud of her success, understanding of her time constraints, willing to adapt our traditions to accommodate her needs. I'd thought I was being a good mother-in-law, supportive and flexible. I'd never considered that she might be systematically replacing me. The phone rang again, interrupting my increasingly dark thoughts. This time it was Helen from next door, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I was just putting together a plate of cookies for you, and I realized I didn't know what time you needed to leave tomorrow. I wanted to make sure I caught you before you headed out to David's." Another lie to tell or truth to reveal. I was getting tired of making these decisions, tired of protecting other people from the uncomfortable reality of my situation. "Actually, Helen, I'm not going anywhere tomorrow. Change of plans." "Oh, are they coming to you after all? I thought maybe—" "No, they're not coming here either. They're having dinner at their house, and it's just for immediate family this year." The raw pause that followed was excruciating. I could practically hear Helen's brain working, trying to process this information, trying to understand how a mother could be excluded from her son's family's Christmas celebration. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Did something happen? Are you not feeling well?" "I'm fine, Helen. They just decided to do things differently this year." "But Margaret, you're his mother. How are you not immediate family?" It was the same question Ruth had asked, and I didn't have a better answer for Helen than I'd had for my sister. The truth was, I didn't understand it either. I didn't understand how 43 years of Christmas traditions could be casually discarded, how decades of love and sacrifice could be reduced to an inconvenience to be managed. After Helen hung up, promising to bring cookies anyway and making concerned noises about families these days, I found myself standing in the middle of my living room, looking at the Christmas tree and feeling like a stranger in my own house. The ornaments that had seemed like treasured memories yesterday now felt like evidence of my own delusions, proof that I'd been clinging to a version of my family that existed only in my imagination. I thought about taking the tree down, boxing up the ornaments, erasing the evidence of my misplaced expectations. But that felt too much like surrender. Too much like admitting that Jennifer had been right to exclude me, that I really wasn't immediate family anymore. Instead, I decided to call David myself. Not to argue or demand inclusion, not to make him choose between his wife and his mother, but to hear his voice, to confirm that he was real and that our relationship, whatever its current state, was still worth preserving. His phone went straight to voicemail. His familiar voice cheerful and professional. "You've reached David Whitmore. I'm either on another call or away from my phone, but if you leave a message, I'll get back to you as soon as possible." I hung up without leaving a message. What would I say? That I was calling to remind him I existed? That I wanted to hear him explain why his wife's definition of immediate family didn't include the woman who had given birth to him? The afternoon stretched ahead of me like a prison sentence. I tried reading but couldn't concentrate. I tried watching television, but every channel seemed to be showing Christmas programming designed to remind me of what I was missing. I tried working on the jigsaw puzzle I'd started last week, but my hands were shaking too much to fit the small pieces together properly. Finally, I decided to go for a walk. The ice had stopped falling, and the air was crisp and clean in the way that only December air can be. I bundled myself into my warmest coat and boots and stepped outside into the crystalline world that winter had created overnight. The neighborhood was quiet, most families probably inside preparing for tomorrow's celebrations. But as I walked, I could see evidence of the holiday everywhere: wreaths on doors, lights twinkling in windows, the warm glow of inhabited houses where people were gathered together, sharing meals and laughter and the comfortable intimacy of belonging somewhere. I found myself walking past David and Jennifer's house, though I hadn't consciously planned to go that direction. Their driveway was full of cars I didn't recognize, and through their front window, I could see people moving around, the suggestion of activity and preparation. Jennifer's parents' car was there, and her sister's SUV with the California plates. I could see figures in the kitchen, multiple people working together to prepare what was probably tomorrow's feast. They were having their own Christmas Eve gathering, I realized. The immediate family was already celebrating, already creating the memories that I would never be part of. Standing on the sidewalk in the growing darkness, looking at the house where my son lived with his family, I felt more invisible than I ever had in my life. A light came on in what I knew was the living room, and for a moment I could see David clearly through the window. He was laughing at something someone had said, his head thrown back in genuine amusement. He looked happy, relaxed, completely content with his life as it was currently arranged. There was no sign that he was missing anyone, no indication that Christmas Eve felt incomplete without his mother's presence. I turned away and walked home quickly, my cheeks burning with cold and something that felt too much like shame. By the time I reached my own house, the Christmas lights Thomas had hung were twinkling in the darkness, and my house looked warm and inviting from the outside. But I knew the truth. It was just an elaborate stage set, designed to look like a home where people lived and loved and celebrated together. Inside, the silence was overwhelming. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it in the kitchen, trying not to think about the preparations happening a mile away, the family gathering that was proceeding perfectly well without me. After dinner, I sat in Thomas's chair and tried to remember other Christmas Eves, better Christmas Eves, when this house had been full of the people I loved most. I remembered the Christmas Eve when David was 12 and had been so excited about giving me the present he'd made in art class that he'd convinced Thomas to let him give it to me early. It had been a ceramic bowl, lopsided and painted in bright colors that didn't quite match, with "World's Best Mom" painted around the rim in his careful 6th grade handwriting. I'd used that bowl for everything for years, until it finally cracked and had to be thrown away. I'd cried when I'd wrapped it in newspaper and put it in the garbage, as if I were throwing away a piece of David's childhood. I remembered the Christmas Eve 5 years ago when Jennifer had surprised me with a photo album she'd put together, filled with pictures of family gatherings over the years. She'd spent months collecting photos from everyone, organizing them, chronologically, adding little captions in her neat handwriting. "For Margaret," she'd written on the first page, "who made our family possible." I'd been so moved by the gesture, so touched by the time and thought she'd put into it, that I'd hugged her with tears in my eyes and told her it was the most meaningful gift anyone had ever given me. That photo album was upstairs in my bedroom, in the drawer of my nightstand where I kept my most precious things. I hadn't looked at it in months, afraid of what I might see there, afraid of how different those smiling faces might look to me now. But tonight, sitting alone in my decorated house on Christmas Eve, I found myself climbing the stairs to retrieve it. I brought it down to the living room and opened it by the light of the Christmas tree, preparing myself for whatever pain the memories might bring. The first photo was from David and Jennifer's wedding day, a picture of the 3 of us together after the ceremony. David looked impossibly young in his tuxedo, his face glowing with happiness. Jennifer was radiant in her white dress, her hand clasped in mine as we stood together outside the church, and I looked proud and grateful, my arm around my new daughter-in-law, my smile genuine and full of hope for the future we would all share together. I turned the page and found photos from subsequent Christmases, evidence of the family we'd built together over the years. There was David carving turkey in my dining room, his face serious with concentration. There was Jennifer helping me in the kitchen, both of us wearing aprons and laughing at some shared joke. There were the grandchildren as babies, as toddlers, as school-age children, always surrounded by the adults who loved them, always at the center of celebrations that brought us all together. In photo after photo, I could see the love that had bound us together, the genuine affection that had made us more than just relatives tied together by marriage and genetics. These people had chosen to love me, had included me in their lives not out of obligation, but out of real fondness for my company. What had happened to those people? Were they still there? Somewhere underneath the busy schedules and competing priorities and gradual drift toward indifference? Or had they been replaced entirely by strangers who looked like my family but no longer felt any real connection to me? I closed the album and held it against my chest, trying to absorb whatever comfort it might offer. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending ice crystals skittering across the glass. The house felt smaller and larger at the same time, intimate in its solitude, but cavernous in its emptiness. I thought about all the Christmas Eves I'd spent in this house, all the years when December 24th had meant anticipation and preparation, and the warm certainty that tomorrow would bring joy. Those memories felt like artifacts from someone else's life now, beautiful but untouchable, like museum pieces displayed behind glass. Tomorrow would be my first Christmas Day alone since Thomas died, and Thomas had been gone for 8 years. Even in those early years of widowhood, when grief had made every holiday feel hollow and strange, I'd still had David and Jennifer and the grandchildren to focus on. I'd still had a role to play, people who needed me, traditions that depended on my participation. Now I had nothing but time and memories, and the growing certainty that this was my life now, that the woman who had once been essential to her family's happiness had become superfluous to their plans. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed. Midnight, marking the official beginning of Christmas Day. Somewhere across town, my family was probably asleep, resting up for their celebration, dreaming of the morning to come. And here I sat in my empty house, surrounded by decorations that suddenly felt like props in a play that had closed without anyone telling me. I turned off the Christmas tree lights and climbed the stairs to my bedroom, leaving the photo album on the coffee table like evidence of a crime. In my bedroom, I changed into my nightgown and brushed my teeth with mechanical precision, going through the motions of preparing for sleep, even though I doubted sleep would come easily. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the streetlight outside played across the plaster, I tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. For the first time in over 40 years, Christmas Day would be unstructured, unplanned, empty of the rituals that had given it meaning. I could sleep late, eat whatever I wanted, watch television or read or sit in silence. I could do anything I wanted, go anywhere I chose. The freedom should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like exile. But even as I lay there in the darkness, feeling sorry for myself and mourning the family gatherings that would never happen again, a small voice in the back of my mind was beginning to whisper something different. Maybe this wasn't just an ending, it suggested. Maybe it was also a beginning. Maybe being cut loose from obligations and expectations meant I could finally discover who Margaret Whitmore was when she wasn't busy being a mother and grandmother and keeper of family traditions. Maybe tomorrow, for the first time in decades, Christmas Day could belong entirely to me. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and I fell asleep clutching it like a lifeline, unsure whether it would save me or pull me under, but grateful to have something to hold on to in the darkness. Christmas morning arrived with deceptive beauty. I woke to find the world outside my bedroom window transformed into something from a greeting card. Every tree branch encased in crystal, the entire neighborhood sparkling under a pale winter sun. For just a moment, before full consciousness returned, I felt the familiar Christmas morning flutter of anticipation. Then reality settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I remembered that today I had nowhere to be and no one expecting me. I stayed in bed longer than I had in years, not because I was tired, but because getting up meant beginning a day I hadn't planned for, a Christmas that belonged to no one but me. Through the walls, I could hear the muffled sounds of my neighbors beginning their celebrations, children's voices rising in excitement, doors opening and closing as relatives arrived, the distant sound of laughter carrying on the cold air. Finally, I forced myself upright and made my way to the kitchen, where the sight of the unused turkey still sitting in the refrigerator felt like a small punishment. I made coffee in my everyday mug and stood at the kitchen window, watching the Harrison family next door loading presents into their car. They were dressed in their Christmas best, probably heading to grandparents' house for dinner. Mrs. Harrison waved when she saw me at the window, and I waved back, wondering if she could tell from my face that I was spending Christmas alone. The morning stretched ahead of me like an empty canvas. For 43 years, Christmas Day had followed the same comfortable pattern: early morning present opening with David's family, followed by hours of cooking and preparation, then the feast itself with its familiar rituals of gratitude and abundance. Now I had no structure, no requirements, no one depending on me for anything. I decided to call my sister Ruth, needing to hear a familiar voice even if it meant admitting how pathetic my situation had become. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with Christmas morning energy. "Merry Christmas, Maggie. How's your morning going? Are the grandkids driving everyone crazy with excitement?" I closed my eyes, grateful she couldn't see my face. "Merry Christmas, Ruth. Actually, I'm home. The family celebration is happening without me today." The silence that followed was loaded with all the questions Ruth was too polite to ask directly. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into what I recognized as her protective older sister mode. "What do you mean without you? Maggie, what exactly is going on over there?" So I told her. Not everything, not the full weight of feeling, erased from my own family's story, but enough to convey that I was spending Christmas Day alone for the first time in decades. Ruth listened without interrupting, but I could feel her growing anger even through the phone line. "This is unacceptable," she finally said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I don't care what Jennifer thinks she's doing, but you don't. Exclude someone's mother from Christmas dinner. It's unconscionable." "Maybe they need space to create their own traditions," I heard myself saying, repeating the rationalization I'd been trying to convince myself was true. Maybe I was too involved in their lives. Too involved? Maggie, you're talking about your son and his family. There's no such thing as too involved when it comes to family. What does David say about all this? That was the question I'd been avoiding, even in my own mind. I hadn't spoken to David directly about any of this. I'd been operating on the assumption that Jennifer had spoken for both of them, that her voicemail represented a joint decision. But what if it didn't? What if David didn't even know I'd been uninvited to Christmas dinner? "I haven't talked to David about it," I admitted. "You haven't talked to him? Maggie, for God's sake, call your son. This might all be a misunderstanding." But even as Ruth was saying it, I knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. The pattern had been building for months, maybe years. I'd just been too invested in maintaining family harmony to acknowledge what was happening. It had started small, so small that I'd dismissed each incident as inconsequential. Last Easter, for instance, when I'd arrived at their house with my traditional lemon cake only to find they'd already bought dessert from a bakery. Jennifer had been gracious about it, of course, saying we'd have both, but I'd seen her exchange a look with David that I'd pretended not to notice. The bakery cake had been served. Mine had sat untouched on the counter. Then there was David's birthday in June. For 38 years, I'd been the one to plan David's birthday celebrations. Even after he'd married Jennifer, even after they'd had children of their own, I'd continued to organize family dinners, to make his favorite chocolate cake with cream cheese frosting, to coordinate gifts and invitations. But this year, when I'd called 2 weeks before his birthday to discuss plans, Jennifer had informed me they'd already made reservations at a restaurant downtown. "Oh," I'd said, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. "Well, that sounds lovely. What time should I meet you there?" "Actually, we're keeping it small this year, just the 5 of us. You understand?" I'd understood, all right. I'd understood that I was being systematically excluded from the occasions that had once been mine to orchestrate. But I'd told myself it was natural, that married couples needed to establish their own traditions, that good mothers learned to step back and let their children take the lead. The signs had been there at Mother's Day too, though I'd worked hard not to see them. Instead of the traditional brunch at my house, Jennifer had suggested we all meet at a restaurant. When I'd mentioned that I'd already bought groceries for our usual spread, she'd laughed and said restaurants were easier, less work for everyone. The grandchildren had seemed confused by the change, asking why we weren't going to Grandma's house like always, but their questions had been deflected with promises of special restaurant desserts. Even the weekly dinners that had been a cornerstone of our family life for years had gradually dwindled to nothing. It had happened so slowly that I hadn't noticed the pattern until it was already complete. First, they'd started canceling occasionally due to work obligations or school events. Then the cancellations had become more frequent, with last-minute texts explaining that they'd already eaten or that the children had too much homework. Eventually, the invitations had stopped coming altogether, and when I'd finally worked up the courage to ask about resuming our weekly tradition, Jennifer had suggested that maybe monthly dinners would be more realistic given everyone's busy schedules. Monthly had become every few months, which had become holidays only, which had now become not even holidays. Looking back, I could see how methodically I'd been marginalized, how carefully Jennifer had managed my transition from integral family member to occasional guest. She'd been skillful about it, never directly confrontational, always having reasonable explanations for each change. And I'd been complicit in my own exile, so desperate to maintain family peace that I'd accepted each reduction in my role without protest. After I hung up with Ruth, promising to consider calling David, I found myself walking through my house with new eyes, seeing evidence everywhere of a life that had been shaped entirely around people who no longer seemed to want or need my presence. The guest bedrooms I'd maintained for family visits that rarely happened anymore. The oversized dining room table that now sat empty most of the time. The refrigerator covered with grandchildren's artwork and school photos, none of them recent. In the hallway, I stopped in front of the collection of framed family photos that had grown over the years. Looking at them now, I could see the progression of my own diminishing presence. In the earlier photos, I was always central, holding babies, flanked by David and Jennifer at family gatherings, clearly belonging to the group. But in the more recent pictures, I noticed I was increasingly positioned at the edges, sometimes partially cut off by the frame, sometimes obviously added as an afterthought. The most recent photo had been taken at David's birthday dinner in June, the restaurant celebration I'd been allowed to attend. In it, David and Jennifer sat close, together with their children arranged around them, looking like the perfect nuclear family. I was squeezed in at the end of the restaurant booth, my smile looking forced and my body language suggesting I was aware I didn't quite belong in the frame. When had I become a peripheral figure in my own family's story? I spent the afternoon trying to distract myself with mundane tasks. I did laundry, reorganized my spice cabinet, and cleaned bathrooms that didn't need cleaning. But every small noise from outside, car doors slamming, children laughing, the distant sound of conversation, reminded me that other families were gathering, that Christmas was happening all around me while I moved through my empty house like a ghost haunting her own life. Around 3 o'clock, the silence became unbearable. I decided to drive to the cemetery where Thomas was buried, not because I expected to find comfort there, but because I needed to be somewhere that acknowledged my connections to other people, even if those people were gone. The cemetery was surprisingly busy for Christmas Day. I wasn't the only person who'd chosen to spend part of the holiday with the dead rather than the living. I parked near Thomas's grave and sat in my car for a few minutes, watching other visitors, placing flowers on headstones, standing in quiet contemplation, some of them clearly emotional. Thomas's grave was marked by a simple granite headstone with his name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved husband and father," that David and I had chosen together 8 years ago. I'd brought a small wreath, though I felt slightly foolish about "Osat." Thomas wouldn't have cared about Christmas decorations on his grave, but I needed the ritual, the gesture of remembrance. Standing there in the cold December air, I found myself talking to him for the first time in months. "I don't know what I did wrong, Tommy," I said quietly, my breath visible in small puffs. "I thought I was being a good mother, a good grandmother. I thought I was doing what you would have wanted me to do, keeping the family together, maintaining the traditions we started." A couple walked past, arm in arm, heading toward a grave several rows away, and I waited until they were out of earshot before continuing. "They don't want me anymore. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way I became unnecessary. To them. Maybe I was always unnecessary and just didn't realize it. Maybe you were the one who held everything together, and without you, there's no reason for them to include me." The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches above me and sending last autumn's leaves skittering across the frozen ground. I pulled my coat tighter and tried to imagine what Thomas would say if he were here, what advice he'd offer about navigating family relationships he'd never had to manage alone. Thomas had been naturally diplomatic, gifted at mediating family disputes and smoothing over hurt feelings. He'd been the one who'd helped me understand David's teenage rebellions, who'd known when to push and when to give space, who'd made family. Gatherings feel effortless even when they required enormous amounts of planning and preparation. After he died, I'd tried to fill both roles, mother and father, host and mediator, the keeper of family harmony and the creator of family traditions. Maybe that had been my mistake. Maybe in trying to be everything to everyone, I'd become too much for anyone to handle comfortably. "I miss you," I told the headstone, stating the obvious but needing to say it anyway. "I miss having someone who understood why family matters, why traditions are worth preserving. I miss having someone who chose to love me, who wanted me around, not because they had to, but because they genuinely enjoyed my company." The admission hung in the cold air like a prayer or a confession. That was what hurt most about my current situation. Not just that I was alone, but that I'd apparently become someone whose company was no longer sought, whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Driving home as the early winter darkness began to fall, I passed house after house glowing with warm light, windows revealing glimpses of family gatherings in progress, dining rooms full of people, children playing in living rooms, adults clustered in kitchens with wine glasses in their hands. The whole world seemed to be celebrating together while I drove through it like a visitor from another planet, observing but not participating. Back home, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table while watching the news. The anchors were cheerful and bright, sharing feel-good Christmas stories about families reuniting and communities coming together. I turned off the television and finished my meal in silence. Later, sitting in Thomas's chair with a cup of tea, I allowed myself to really examine the pattern of exclusion that had brought me to this point. It hadn't been sudden or dramatic. It had been a gradual erosion, so subtle that I'd rationalized each small rejection as reasonable, temporary, or even considerate. When Jennifer had started suggesting restaurants instead of family dinners at my house, I told myself she was trying to spare me the work of cooking and cleaning. When my weekly babysitting duties for the grandchildren had been quietly discontinued, I'd assumed it was because they were old enough not to need supervision. When family photographs began featuring me less prominently, I'd convinced myself it was because the younger generation preferred candid shots to formal poses. But looking at the progression now, with the harsh clarity that Christmas Day alone provides, I could see it for what it was, a systematic campaign to move me from the center of family life to its periphery. Jennifer had managed it brilliantly, never confronting me directly, never saying anything that could be construed as overtly hostile. She'd simply begun making decisions that excluded me, establishing new traditions that didn't include me, creating a family structure in which I was optional rather than essential, and David had allowed it to happen. Whether through active agreement or passive compliance, my son had participated in my marginalization. That realization was perhaps the most painful of all, because it meant that the child I'd raised, the man I'd loved unconditionally for 41 years, had decided that keeping peace with his wife was more important than maintaining a relationship with his mother. The phone rang around 8 o'clock, startling me out of my dark reverie. The caller ID showed David's number, and for a moment my heart leaped with hope. Maybe he was calling to wish me Merry Christmas. Maybe he'd realized I was spending the holiday alone and wanted to invite me over for dessert. Maybe there was still a chance to salvage something from this disaster of a day. "Hi, David," I answered, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Hi, Mom. Merry Christmas. How was your day?" The casual tone of his voice, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if it were perfectly normal for his mother to spend Christmas alone, hit me like a physical blow. He didn't sound guilty or concerned or even curious about how I'd spent the holiday. He sounded like someone making a polite, obligatory phone call. "It was quiet," I managed to say. "How was yours?" "Great. Really nice. Jennifer's parents brought this amazing prime rib, and the kids loved their new bikes. We're all pretty stuffed and happy." He talked for a few minutes about the day's events, describing the meal I hadn't been invited to share, the family gathering I hadn't been included in, the grandchildren's excitement over gifts I hadn't been present to witness. His tone was cheerful and satisfied, with no indication that anything had been missing from their celebration. "That sounds wonderful," I said. When he finished, and I meant it, I was glad they'd had a good day. I just wished I could have been part of it. "Listen, Mom, I should probably go. Jennifer's starting a movie with the kids, and I promised I'd make popcorn." "Of course. Give everyone my love." "I will. Talk to you soon." He hung up without asking how I'd spent the day, without acknowledging that this was the first Christmas in over 4 decades that we hadn't shared together, without seeming to notice or care that his mother had been alone for the holiday. I sat holding the phone for a long time after the line went dead, trying to process what I'd just experienced. The conversation had felt like an performance, as if David were going through the motions of being a dutiful son while carefully avoiding any topic that might lead to uncomfortable questions or awkward explanations. Maybe Jennifer had coached him on what to say and what not to ask. Maybe he'd been instructed to call and check the box marked "Contacted Mother on Christmas" without getting drawn into any discussions about why she hadn't been invited to join the family celebration. Or maybe he genuinely didn't see anything wrong with the current arrangement. Maybe he thought spending Christmas alone was a reasonable option for his 72-year-old widowed mother. Maybe he'd convinced himself that I preferred solitude to the chaos of family gatherings. The thought that David might actually believe I was happier alone was almost more depressing than the thought that he'd consciously chosen to exclude me. At least conscious exclusion would have acknowledged that I had feelings worth considering. Assuming I preferred isolation suggested that he'd stopped thinking about my emotional needs altogether. That night, lying in bed and listening to the wind rattle my bedroom windows, I tried to imagine what next Christmas would look like. Would this become the new normal? Would I spend every major holiday alone from now on, receiving polite phone calls from my son and daughter-in-law, being updated on family celebrations I was no longer invited to join? The prospect felt unbearable, but I wasn't sure what alternatives I had. I could confront David directly, demand to know why I'd been excluded, and insist on being included in future gatherings. But that would make me the family villain, the difficult mother-in-law who couldn't accept that times change, who insisted on inserting herself where she wasn't wanted. I could try to rebuild my relationship with Jennifer, though I wasn't sure what had gone wrong in the first place or how to fix it. Maybe I could invite them all to dinner, prove that I was still capable of hosting successful family gatherings. But the thought of putting myself in a position to be rejected again felt too risky, too vulnerable. Or I could accept that this chapter of my life was over and try to figure out what came next. Maybe Ruth was right that families these days were different, That adult children didn't feel the same obligations to include elderly parents in their lives that previous generations had taken for granted. Maybe I needed to stop trying to hold on to relationships that were evolving beyond my ability to influence them. But even as I considered that possibility, I felt a profound sense of loss. Not just for the Christmas dinners and family gatherings I'd apparently attended for the last time, but for the sense of purpose and belonging that had defined my identity for so many years. Without my role as family matriarch, keeper of traditions, and central organizing force for holiday celebrations, who was I supposed to be? The question haunted me as I finally drifted off to sleep, my empty house settling around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Tomorrow would be the day after Christmas, the beginning of a new year that I would apparently be navigating without the family connections that had once given my life structure and meaning. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly on my own, and I had no idea what that was supposed to look like or how I was supposed to feel about it. The only thing I knew for certain was that something fundamental had shifted, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a strange suspension of time. The world seemed muted, caught between the exhaustion of holiday celebration and the anticipation of fresh beginnings. I moved through my days mechanically, accomplishing small tasks without much purpose, watching the neighborhood slowly return to its normal rhythms as decorations came down and life resumed its ordinary patterns. I kept expecting someone to call. Not David necessarily, though part of me hoped he might realize how unusual it was that his mother had spent Christmas alone. Maybe Jennifer with some explanation or apology. Maybe one of the grandchildren, wondering why Grandma hadn't been at Christmas dinner. But my phone remained stubbornly quiet, and with each passing day, it became clearer that my absence from their celebration had caused no noticeable disruption in their lives. On the morning of December 30th, I finally forced myself to deal with the turkey that had been sitting in my refrigerator like an accusation for a week. I'd been avoiding it, unable to decide whether throwing it away was wasteful or keeping it was masochistic. But practical concerns finally won out over emotional paralysis, and I spent the morning roasting it, filling my house with the rich, familiar smell of Christmas dinner arriving 7 days too late. As the turkey cooked, I found myself thinking about my lawyer, Harold Brennan, whom I hadn't spoken to in over 2 years. Harold had handled Thomas's estate after he died, and he'd helped me organize my own affairs in the careful, methodical way that good lawyers approach such things. My will was simple and straightforward, everything to David, with provisions for the grandchildren's education. It had seemed obvious at the time, the natural order of things. But sitting in my kitchen, surrounded by the aroma of a holiday feast no one would share, I began to wonder if my assumptions about natural order needed reconsideration. The idea that surfaced was so shocking that I almost dismissed it immediately. But it persisted, growing stronger as I basted the turkey and watched the winter light fade outside my windows. If my family no longer valued my presence in their lives, if I had truly become as peripheral as this Christmas had suggested, then perhaps my death would be equally unremarkable to them. Perhaps they were simply waiting for me to fade away quietly, leaving behind my house and my savings and my accumulated possessions for them to distribute among themselves. The thought was bitter, but not entirely unfair. I had spent decades organizing my life around their needs and preferences, planning for a future in which my primary legacy would be financial rather than emotional. But what if there were other people in the world who might actually appreciate what I had to offer? What if my resources could go to someone who would value them, rather than to family members who seemed to view me as an obligation rather than a blessing? I called Harold's office that afternoon, surprising his secretary, who probably hadn't expected to hear from me so soon after the holidays. Harold was semi-retired now, only taking appointments 2 days a week, but he agreed to see me the following Tuesday. I didn't tell him what I wanted to discuss, just that I needed to review my estate planning documents. The weekend stretched ahead of me with its familiar emptiness, but for the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something other than sadness or confusion. I felt a strange sense of possibility, as if I were standing at the edge of a cliff and considering whether jumping might actually be flying. I spent Saturday afternoon going through my jewelry box, really looking at each piece for the first time in years. There was my engagement ring from Thomas, a modest solitaire that had seemed impossibly elegant when he'd placed it on my finger 51 years ago. There was the string of pearls he'd given me for our 10th anniversary, and the gold bracelet that had been his last gift to me before he died. There were pieces from my mother and grandmother, jewelry that carried the weight of family history and the expectation that it would be passed down to future generations. I held each piece up to the light, remembering when I'd received it and imagining who might treasure it next. Would my granddaughter Emma appreciate my grandmother's cameo brooch when she was old enough to understand its significance? Would little Sarah cherish the pearl earrings that had been my mother's wedding gift to me? Or would these things end up in a jewelry box in Jennifer's bedroom, kept out of politeness but never worn, gradually forgotten until they became curiosities in an estate sale? The uncertainty was liberating in an unexpected way. If I couldn't predict how my family would treat my memory, then I was free to make choices based on my own values rather than their expectations. Sunday morning brought an unusual visitor. I was in my kitchen, making coffee and half listening to the church bells across town, when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see a young woman standing on my porch, stamping her feet against the cold. She looked familiar, but it took me a moment to place her. It was Angela Morrison, who lived 3 streets over with her 2 small children. I knew her from the grocery store and the occasional neighborhood gathering, one of those pleasant acquaintanceships that never quite develop into friendship, but provide a sense of community connection. She was probably 35, a single mother who worked as a nurse at the county hospital, and always seemed to be rushing between responsibilities. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said when I opened the door, her breath visible in small puffs. "I'm sorry to bother you, especially so early on a Sunday, but I wondered if I could ask you a favor." She looked embarrassed, the kind of discomfort that comes with having to ask for help from someone you don't know well. I invited her in, noting how carefully she wiped her feet and how her eyes took in the details of my house with the appreciation of someone who noticed quality when she saw it. "My babysitter had a family emergency," she explained, accepting the cup of coffee I offered. "And I'm scheduled to work a double shift today. I know it's a lot to ask, but would you be willing to watch Madison and Tyler for a few hours? I've seen how good you are with children, and the kids always wave to you when we walk by." The request was so unexpected that I almost laughed. Here I was, convinced that no one needed me anymore, and this young mother was asking me to care for her children. It felt like a sign from the universe, a reminder that usefulness could take many forms. "Of course," I said immediately. "Bring them over whenever you need to. How old are they now?" "Madison just turned 6, and Tyler's 4. They're good kids, I promise. They'll probably just want to watch cartoons and eat whatever snacks you're willing to share." Angela left to get the children, and I found myself suddenly energized in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. I rummaged through my kitchen cabinets, looking for child-friendly snacks, and I cleared space in my living room for the kind of comfortable chaos that comes with small visitors. Madison and Tyler arrived bundled in winter coats and mittens, their faces bright with cold and curiosity. Madison was dark-haired and serious, with the kind of careful politeness that suggested she'd been coached on good behavior. Tyler was blonde and perpetually in motion, the kind of 4-year-old who treats every room like a playground waiting to be discovered. "Thank you so much for this," Angela said, looking harried but grateful. "I should be back by 6, maybe 7 at the latest. They've had breakfast and I packed some snacks, but please don't hesitate to feed them lunch if they get hungry." After she left, I found myself alone with 2 small strangers who were looking at me with the open assessment that children bring to new situations. I hadn't been responsible for young children in years, not since my grandchildren had outgrown the need for constant supervision. "Would you like to see my Christmas tree?" I asked, and both children nodded eagerly. For the next hour, Madison and Tyler explored my house with the kind of thorough attention that adults rarely bring to new environments. They admired the ornaments on my tree, asking about the stories behind various decorations. They examined the family photographs on my mantel with genuine interest, listening as I explained who people were and when the pictures had been taken. "Is this your family?" Madison asked, pointing to a photo of last year's Christmas dinner. "Yes," I said simply. "That's my son David and his wife Jennifer, and those are my grandchildren." "Where are they now?" Tyler wanted to know. "They're at their own house, having their own Christmas." Madison studied my face with the kind of perception that children sometimes possess, as if she could sense there was more to the story than I was telling. But she didn't push for details, just nodded and moved on to the next photograph. We spent the morning baking cookies, something I hadn't done with children in years. Madison was careful and methodical, following instructions precisely and worrying about making mistakes. Tyler was enthusiastic and messy, more interested in eating cookie dough than creating perfect shapes. Watching them work, I was reminded of why I'd loved teaching elementary school all those years ago. How children's natural curiosity and unguarded emotions could make even ordinary activities feel magical. "My mom says you used to be a teacher," Madison said as we waited for the first batch of cookies to finish baking. "I was. For 32 years, I taught 3rd grade. Did you like it?" The question was so direct, so genuine, that I found myself really considering my answer rather than giving the polite response adults usually expect. "I loved it," I said honestly. "I loved watching children learn new things, seeing their faces light up when they finally understood something that had been puzzling them. I loved being part of that moment when reading suddenly makes sense, or when math stops being scary and becomes interesting." "Why did you stop?" "I got older, and I thought it was time to let younger teachers take over, but sometimes I miss it." Tyler, who had been listening while carefully arranging chocolate chips on a cookie, looked up at me with cookie dough on his chin. "Could you teach me something?" The simple request hit me harder than it should have. When was the last time someone had asked me to share knowledge, to be useful in the way I'd trained myself to be useful? When was the last time anyone had looked at me and seen someone with something valuable to offer? I spent the rest of the morning teaching Tyler to tie his shoes properly and helping Madison with a puzzle she'd brought in her backpack. We read stories together, with the children snuggled against me on the couch in a way that felt natural and right. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again, like a person with purpose and value. When Angela returned that evening, she found all 3 of us in the kitchen making dinner together. The children had insisted on helping, and we'd managed to create a simple but satisfying meal of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. "I can't thank you enough," Angela said, looking genuinely moved by the scene she'd walked into. "The kids look so happy and relaxed. I was worried they'd be homesick or difficult." "They were wonderful," I said, and meant it. It's been a long time since I've had young people in the house. I'd forgotten how much joy children bring to ordinary activities. As Angela bundled the children into their coats and prepared to leave, Madison hugged me tightly around the waist. "Can we come back sometime?" she asked. "I want to finish the puzzle, and Tyler wants to learn more about cookies." "You're welcome anytime," I told her, surprised by how much I meant it. After they left, my house felt different. Not empty, exactly, but expectant, as if it had remembered what it was like to be filled with young voices and was hoping they'd return soon. I cleaned up the kitchen slowly, savoring the evidence of the day's activities, the small messes that proved children had been here and had been happy. That night, I called my sister Ruth and told her about my day with Madison and Tyler. Ruth listened with growing excitement, asking questions about the children and their mother, clearly pleased to hear something other than sadness in my voice. "You sound more like yourself than you have in weeks," she said. Maybe this is what you need, Maggie. Maybe instead of waiting for your family to remember you exist, you should focus on building relationships with people who actually appreciate your company. Ruth's words stayed with me as I prepared for bed. There was truth in what she'd said. Uncomfortable, but undeniable. I had been waiting for my family to include me, to value me, to make space for me in their lives. But waiting was passive, and passivity had gotten me exactly nowhere. Maybe it was time to stop waiting and start choosing. Monday morning, I called Angela at work and asked if she'd like to bring the children over for dinner sometime that week. Her voice brightened immediately, and she accepted with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she didn't receive many social invitations. Actually, she said, I've been wanting to ask you something. Madison's been struggling with reading and her teacher suggested she might benefit from some extra help. I can't afford a tutor, but would you be willing to work with her? I could pay you something, maybe not what a professional tutor would charge, but something. I didn't want payment for helping a child learn to read, but I understood that Angela needed to feel she was contributing something to the arrangement. We settled on a modest fee that would make her comfortable while giving me something I'd forgotten I missed, the opportunity to teach. Tuesday morning, I drove to Harold Brennan's law office with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. Harold was in his early 70s now, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of calm competence that made difficult conversations easier to navigate. "Margaret," he said, rising from behind his desk to greet me. "You look well. I hope you had a nice Christmas." I settled into the chair across from his desk and considered how to answer that question honestly. Actually, Harold, Christmas was something of a revelation. It clarified some things for me about my family relationships, and I think it's time to reconsider my estate planning. Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but attentive. "What kind of changes are you thinking about?" For the next hour, I explained my situation as objectively as I could. I told him about being excluded from Christmas dinner, about the gradual marginalization I'd experienced over the past year, about the growing sense that my family viewed me as an obligation rather than a beloved member. I was careful not to sound bitter or vindictive, just realistic about relationships that had apparently changed in ways I hadn't been willing to acknowledge. "I'm not interested in punishing anyone," I said, "but I'm also not interested in leaving everything I've worked for to people who don't seem to value my presence in their lives. I'd like to explore other options." Harold took notes as I talked, asking clarifying questions but not offering judgments about my family's behavior. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me thoughtfully. "Estate planning should reflect your values and relationships as they actually exist, not as we wish they existed," he said. "If your family dynamic has changed, it's perfectly reasonable to reconsider how you want to distribute your assets. What did you have in mind?" I had been thinking about this question for days, considering possibilities that ranged from modest adjustments to complete overhauls. But talking to Angela and spending time with her children had helped clarify my thinking. "I'd like to set up educational funds," I said. "Scholarships for single mothers who want to go back to school, maybe specifically for women who want to become teachers. I think I'd like to leave my house to someone who would actually live in it and appreciate it, rather than selling it immediately for the cash value." Harold nodded, making more notes. "Those are wonderful ideas. We can certainly structure something like that. What about your family? Did you want to leave them anything?" I had been dreading this question, but now that it was asked, I found I had a clear answer. "I'd like to leave something for my grandchildren's education, but in trust until they're older. And I think I'd like to give David and Jennifer a modest amount, enough to be meaningful but not enough to change their lives dramatically. I want them to know I didn't forget them, but I also don't want to reward behavior that hurt me." We spent another hour discussing specifics, and Harold promised to draft documents for my review within the week. As I left his office, I felt lighter than I had in months, as if I'd finally stopped carrying a burden I hadn't realized was so heavy. That afternoon, Madison came over for her first reading lesson. She was shy at first, embarrassed about the words she struggled with, but gradually she relaxed as she realized I wasn't going to judge her or lose patience with her mistakes. We worked on phonics and sight words, and I watched her confidence grow as she successfully read sentences that had seemed impossible 30 minutes earlier. "You're a good teacher," she said as we finished our session. "Better than the one at school." The compliment was innocent and honest, the kind of feedback children give without calculation or agenda. It reminded me of why I'd become a teacher in the first place, and why I'd loved it for so many years. I had skills and knowledge that could make a real difference in a child's life, and maybe it was time to remember that teaching was about more than just my professional career. That evening, I called the local literacy center and asked about volunteer opportunities. The woman who answered the phone was delighted to hear from me, explaining that they were always in need of volunteers with teaching experience, especially people who could work with adult learners who were trying to improve their reading skills. I scheduled an orientation for the following week, and as I hung up the phone, I realized that for the first time since Christmas Eve, I was looking forward to something. Not waiting for someone else to include me, not hoping for invitation or acceptance, but actively choosing to engage with the world in ways that aligned with my values and interests. The week before New Year's Eve brought unexpected snowfall, transforming the neighborhood into something soft and magical. I watched from my kitchen window as children built snowmen in their yards and adults shoveled driveways with good-natured grumbling. The world looked clean and fresh, full of possibility. On Friday, Angela brought both children over for dinner as we'd planned. I'd prepared a simple meal of spaghetti and meatballs, something I knew they'd enjoy, and I'd set the dining room table with my good china, because I'd decided that children deserved the same respect I'd once reserved for adult guests. Madison had made remarkable progress in her reading during our week of lessons, and she proudly read me a short story from her school book while Tyler colored at the kitchen table. Angela watched with tears in her eyes, clearly amazed by her daughter's improvement. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Madison's teacher says she's like a different child in class this week. More confident, more willing to try difficult words. Reading is just like any other skill," I explained. "Children need time and patience and encouragement. Most struggling readers aren't lacking intelligence. They just need someone to help them find the key that unlocks the code." As we ate dinner, I found myself really listening to these people in a way I hadn't listened to anyone in months. Angela told me about her work at the hospital, the challenges of being a single mother, her dreams of eventually going back to school to become a nurse practitioner. The children chattered about school and friends and their plans for New Year's Eve, which apparently involved staying up until 9 p.m. and having a pretend midnight celebration. "What are your plans for New Year's Eve?" Angela asked as we finished dessert. I realized I hadn't even thought about it. For years, New Year's Eve had meant either going to David and Jennifer's house or having them come to mine for a quiet family celebration. This year, I supposed I'd spend it alone, watching the ball drop on television like millions of other solitary people. "I haven't made any plans yet," I admitted. Madison looked up from her ice cream with sudden inspiration. "You could come to our house. We're going to make pizza and watch movies and play games." "Madison," Angela said gently, "Mrs. Whitmore probably has other things she'd rather do." But looking at Madison's eager face, at Tyler nodding enthusiastically, at Angela's genuine invitation, I realized there was nowhere else I'd rather be. These people wanted my company, valued my presence, seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with me. "Actually," I said, "that sounds perfect." As they prepared to leave that evening, Madison hugged me again with the unself-conscious affection that children bring to relationships they trust. Tyler, emboldened by his sister's example, hugged me too, his small arms barely reaching around my waist. "I love coming here," Madison whispered. "Your house feels like home." After they left, I sat in my living room thinking about that comment. Your house feels like home. When was the last time anyone had said something like that to me? When was the last time my house had actually functioned as a home, a place where people gathered because they wanted to be there, because they felt comfortable and welcome and loved? Maybe that was what I'd been mourning since Christmas Eve. Not just the exclusion from my family's celebration, but the loss of my role as someone who created home for other people, who made space in the world for connection and belonging and shared joy. But maybe that role didn't have to be limited to biological family. Maybe home was something you created wherever you were willing to open your heart and your door to people who needed what you had to offer. The snow continued falling outside my windows, covering the world in pristine white, and for the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely hopeful about what the new year might bring. New Year's Eve at Angela's house turned out to be exactly what I needed. Her small apartment was warm and cluttered in the way homes with young children always are, full of toys and books and the comfortable chaos of people actually living their lives. Madison and Tyler had decorated the living room with handmade streamers and balloons, creating their own festive atmosphere that felt more genuine than any elaborate party I'd ever attended. We made personal pizzas together, each of us creating our own combinations of toppings, while Tyler provided a running commentary on why pineapple belonged on pizza, and Madison argued for the superiority of plain cheese. Angela opened a bottle of wine for us and gave the children sparkling apple cider and champagne flutes she'd bought at the dollar store, making them feel sophisticated and included in the celebration. At 9 o'clock, we had our pretend midnight countdown, complete with noisemakers and confetti. As the children shouted, "Happy New Year!" and threw streamers into the air, I felt something shift inside me, a sense of genuine celebration that I hadn't experienced in months. This was what joy looked like, I realized. Not the careful, orchestrated happiness of perfect family gatherings, but the spontaneous delight of people who chose to be together. When Angela put the children to bed, I helped clean up the kitchen, and we sat together on her couch with the last of the wine, talking quietly while the real midnight approached. She told me more about her plans to return to school, her dreams of giving her children a more stable life, her struggles with feeling isolated as a single mother in a world that seemed designed for traditional families. "I know we haven't known each other long," she said as the evening wound down, "but having you in our lives has made such a difference. Madison's reading has improved dramatically, and both kids light up when they talk about visiting your house. You've given them something I couldn't provide on my own." "You've given me something too," I replied, meaning it completely. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed, to have something valuable to offer. Your children remind me that I'm still useful in this world. As midnight approached, we watched the ball drop on television, toasting the new year with the dregs of our wine and making modest resolutions. Angela hoped to save enough money to start taking evening classes in the fall. I found myself promising to volunteer more, to find ways to use my teaching skills in the community, to stop waiting for life to happen to me and start making choices about the kind of person I wanted to be. Walking home that night under the stars, my neighborhood blanketed in fresh snow, I felt lighter than I had in years. The streets were quiet except for the distant sound of fireworks and celebration, and my breath formed small clouds in the cold air as I made my way back to my house. But it didn't feel like returning to isolation anymore. It felt like going home to a place that was becoming something new, a launching pad for the life I was building rather than a museum of the life I'd lost. January brought routine and purpose in equal measure. 3 mornings a week, I worked with Madison on her reading, watching her confidence grow as she tackled increasingly difficult books. Twice a week, I volunteered at the Literacy Center, working with adult learners who were trying to improve their reading skills for work or personal satisfaction. One woman, Maria, was studying for her GED after dropping out of high school to have a baby 20 years earlier. Another, Robert, was a grandfather who had hidden his illiteracy his entire adult life and was finally ready to learn to read the bedtime stories his grandchildren brought him. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Each small breakthrough felt like a victory, each moment of understanding a gift. I remembered why I'd become a teacher in the first place, the deep satisfaction that comes from helping another person unlock new possibilities for themselves. On weekends, Angela and the children often came over for dinner or spent afternoons at my house. I taught Tyler to play simple card games and helped Madison with her homework. We baked cookies and did art projects and read stories together, creating new traditions that belonged to us rather than repeating old ones that had been taken away. Harold called in mid-January to tell me the new will was ready for my signature. I drove to his office on a gray Tuesday morning, feeling nervous, but determined. The documents were thick and official, full of legal language that formalized the decisions I'd been thinking about for weeks. The house would go to Angela and her children, with the stipulation that they could live in it as long as they needed and sell it only if they truly wanted to move elsewhere. My savings would fund scholarships for single mothers returning to education, specifically those interested in becoming teachers. My jewelry would be divided between Madison and Emma, my granddaughter, to be received when they reached 18. David and Jennifer would inherit a modest but meaningful sum, enough to acknowledge our relationship, but not enough to make them wealthy. The most important addition was a letter I'd written to be opened after my death, explaining my decisions not with bitterness, but with love and hope. I wanted David to understand that this wasn't punishment, but recognition of how our relationship had evolved, and encouragement for him to find happiness in the life he'd chosen to build. As I signed the documents, Harold looked at me with approval. "This is a thoughtful plan, Margaret. You're making sure your legacy reflects your values and goes to people who will appreciate it. That's what good estate planning should accomplish." Walking out of his office that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of completion, as if I'd finally aligned my intentions with my reality. I wasn't angry at my family anymore, wasn't waiting for them to change or include me or recognize my worth. I was simply moving forward with my life, making choices that felt authentic and meaningful. February brought an unexpected phone call from David. I was in my kitchen, preparing dinner for Angela and the children, when his name appeared on my caller ID. For a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity won out over caution. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carrying a note I couldn't quite identify. "How are you doing?" "I'm well, David. Busy, but well. How are Jennifer and the children?" We made small talk for a few minutes, discussing the weather and work and ordinary, topics that required no emotional investment. But then David's voice changed, became more hesitant. "Mom, I wanted to ask you something. Jennifer's been planning Emma's birthday party for next month, and she mentioned that you usually make the birthday cakes for the kids. She wondered if you'd be willing to make Emma's cake this year." The request hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure either of us was prepared to discuss. After months of exclusion, they wanted me to resume my role as cake baker, to provide a service they valued while apparently remaining peripheral to the actual celebration. "That's thoughtful of Jennifer to think of me," I said carefully. "But I'm not sure I'll be available. I've got quite a busy schedule these days." David paused, clearly not expecting this response. "Oh. Well, when is good for you? We could work around your schedule." "Actually, David, I think it might be time for Jennifer to start making the birthday cakes herself. It's a nice tradition for mothers to have with their children." Another pause, longer this time. "Right. I guess that makes sense." I just thought, well, the kids always loved your cakes. I'm sure Jennifer can make lovely cakes. She's very capable. The conversation ended awkwardly, with David sounding confused and slightly hurt. though I couldn't imagine why he'd be surprised that I wasn't eager to provide unpaid catering services for a party I wouldn't be invited to attend. Angela arrived, with the children shortly after I hung up, and Madison immediately noticed that I seemed distracted. "Are you okay, Mrs. Margaret?" she asked, using the name she'd settled on that felt more personal than Mrs. Whitmore, but maintained the respect her mother insisted on. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just had a phone call that reminded me how much my life has changed lately." "Good changes or bad changes?" Tyler wanted to know. I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have said the changes were devastating, that losing my central role in my family's life was the worst thing that could happen to me. But sitting in my kitchen with these children who genuinely enjoyed my company, thinking about the meaningful work I was doing at the literacy center, remembering the satisfaction of helping Maria read her first complete novel, I had to admit the changes had been largely positive. "Good changes," I said, meaning it. "Different from what I expected, but good." Spring arrived early that year, bringing warm sunshine and the first tentative green shoots in my garden. I spent weekends working in the yard with Tyler, teaching him to plant seeds and explaining how flowers grew from tiny beginnings into something beautiful. Madison preferred to sit on the porch with a book, reading aloud to practice her skills while Tyler and I worked in the dirt. The three of us had settled into comfortable routines that felt natural and unforced. Sunday dinners at my house had become a tradition, with Angela bringing dessert and the children helping me cook. Madison's reading had improved so dramatically that her teacher had moved her into an advanced reading group, and Tyler was already showing interest in learning to read himself. In April, Angela approached me with a proposal that surprised and delighted me. "I've been accepted into the nursing program at the community college," she said, her face glowing with excitement and anxiety. "It's a 2-year program, and I can do most of the classes in the evenings and weekends. But there will be some clinical rotations that might conflict with the kids' schedules, and I'll need reliable childcare." She paused, looking nervous. "I know it's a lot to ask, but would you consider being their primary babysitter? I can pay you, and it wouldn't be forever, just until I finish the program. The kids love spending time with you, and I trust you completely." The offer was perfect in ways Angela couldn't have known. It would give me regular, meaningful responsibility for children I'd grown to love, provide me with income that would make me feel useful rather than charitable, and help a deserving young mother achieve her dreams. Most importantly, it would cement the family-like bonds we'd been building over the past months. "I would be honored," I told her, and we hugged in my kitchen while Madison and Tyler cheered from the living room, where they'd been eavesdropping on our conversation. That summer was the best I'd had in years. With Angela in school and working part-time, I became the children's primary caregiver during the day. We established routines that felt natural and comfortable: morning reading time, afternoon activities, in the garden or at the park, cooking lessons that taught basic math and science along with kitchen skills. Madison's reading advanced to the point where she was reading chapter books independently, and I had the joy of introducing her to some of my favorite childhood stories. Tyler surprised everyone by learning to read earlier than expected, motivated by his desire to keep up with his sister and his natural curiosity about the world around him. I also began volunteering more extensively at the literacy center, eventually taking on coordination responsibilities for their adult education programs. The work was demanding but fulfilling, using skills I'd developed over decades of teaching while addressing real community needs. My house came alive in ways it hadn't for years. Instead of echoing with silence and memories, it buzzed with the daily activities of growing children. Madison's artwork covered my refrigerator. Tyler's toys found permanent homes in corners of my living room, and Angela's textbooks and nursing supplies claimed space on my kitchen table where she studied. After putting the children to bed, in August, David called again, this time with news that surprised me. "Mom, Jennifer and I have been talking, and we realize we've been distant lately. We'd like to have you over for dinner soon, maybe start getting together more regularly. Again. The invitation felt hollow and late, an attempt to restore a relationship they'd damaged without acknowledging their role in its deterioration. I found myself less interested in reconciliation than I would have expected 6 months earlier. That's kind of you to think of me, David, but I'm quite busy these days. I'm caring for 2 children while their mother is in nursing school, and I volunteer at the literacy center several times a week. My schedule is pretty full. Oh. David sounded genuinely surprised, as if he'd expected me to be sitting in my empty house waiting for their invitation. Well, maybe we could work something out. The kids have been asking about you. The mention of my grandchildren gave me pause, but not for the reasons David probably expected. I missed them, but I'd also learned that missing people who don't miss you back is a choice, not an obligation. I'd built meaningful relationships with children who actually wanted to spend time with me, who appreciated my attention and returned my affection without reservation. I'm sure they're doing well, I said diplomatically. Give them my love. The conversation ended with vague promises to try to find time to get together, but I knew neither of us was particularly motivated to make it happen. David's family had moved on without me, and I'd moved on without them. We were all probably better off acknowledging that reality rather than forcing connections that no longer felt natural. In September, Angela graduated from her nursing program, with honors, landing a position at the regional medical center that offered good benefits and a schedule that would allow her to spend more time with her children. The celebration dinner we held at my house felt like a real family gathering, full of genuine pride and shared joy. I couldn't have done this without you, Angela told me as we cleaned up the kitchen afterward. You made it possible for me to focus on school because I knew the kids were not just safe, but truly loved while I was away. You gave me purpose, I replied. You and the children reminded me that I still had something valuable to offer the world. We helped each other. That autumn brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, planting bulbs for next spring's flowers, when I looked up to see Jennifer standing on my front porch. She was well-dressed as always, but there was something uncertain in her posture that I hadn't seen before. I continued working in the dirt while she approached, giving her time to find whatever words she'd come to say. Margaret, she said finally, I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. Of course not. What can I do for you? Jennifer looked around at my garden, where Madison's and Tyler's handprints were preserved in decorative stepping stones, where a small playhouse had been built under the old oak tree, where evidence of children's presence was visible in every corner. I wanted to apologize, she said simply. I realized recently that we've been thoughtless, excluding you from family gatherings, not including you in plans. I'm sorry. The apology was probably sincere, but it felt incomplete, lacking any acknowledgement of the systematic nature of my exclusion or any understanding of how it had affected me. It was the kind of apology that asked for forgiveness without accepting responsibility. I appreciate you saying that, I replied, brushing dirt from my hands. But I want you to know that I've moved on. I'm not angry anymore, and I'm not waiting for things to go back to the way they were. Jennifer looked puzzled, as if this wasn't the response she'd expected. But we'd like you to be part of the family again. The children miss you, and David feels bad about how distant we've become. I am part of a family, I said, gesturing toward the house where I could hear Madison and Tyler's voices as they worked on homework at my kitchen table. Just not yours. The bluntness of the statement seemed to shock Jennifer, but I felt no desire to soften it with politeness or false reassurance. This was my truth now, simple and unapologetic. Jennifer left shortly afterward, and I returned to my bulb planting with a sense of closure I hadn't expected to feel. That chapter of my life was truly finished, not with anger or bitterness, but with acceptance and even gratitude for the lessons it had taught me about resilience and self-worth. As winter approached, I reflected on the year that had passed since that devastating Christmas Eve phone call. 12 months ago, I'd been a woman whose identity was entirely bound up in being needed by family members who no longer valued her presence. Today, I was someone who chose how to spend her time and energy, who contributed meaningfully to her community, who was genuinely loved by people who demonstrated that love through their actions rather than their words. The holidays. This year would be different again, but by choice rather than exclusion. Angela, Madison, and Tyler would spend Christmas Day with me, creating new traditions that belonged to all of us. We would cook together, exchange gifts we'd chosen with care, and celebrate the family we'd built through affection and commitment rather than genetics and obligation. On Christmas Eve, as I put the finishing touches on the feast we'd share tomorrow, Madison came into the kitchen and hugged me around the waist. "I'm glad you're going to be our family forever," she said with the casual certainty children bring to statements about the future. "Me too, sweetheart," I replied, meaning it with every fiber of my being. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, covering the world in the pristine white that makes everything look new and full of possibility. Inside my warm kitchen, surrounded by the sounds and smells of preparation for tomorrow's celebration, I felt deeply grateful for the unexpected path my life had taken. Sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in the worst moments, and sometimes losing the family you thought you needed leads you to finding the family you actually deserve. As I stood watching the snow fall outside my window, I knew that this Christmas would be everything the last one hadn't been: joyful, genuine, and filled with people who had chosen to love me just as I had chosen to love them. 2 years later, I stood in the same kitchen where I'd received that life-changing voicemail, but everything around me had transformed. The walls that once echoed with silence now hummed with the comfortable chaos of a home that was truly lived in. Madison's spelling tests were magneted to the refrigerator next to Tyler's drawings of our garden, and Angela's nursing schedule was pinned to the bulletin board that had once held only my own sparse appointments. The morning light streamed through windows that looked out on a backyard where a wooden swing set now stood beneath the old oak tree, where raised garden beds held the remnants of this year's vegetables, where chalk drawings on the sidewalk told the story of children who felt safe enough to make permanent marks on their world. I was making French toast for Christmas morning breakfast, a tradition that had emerged naturally from Madison's request 2 years ago and had become as sacred to us as any ritual passed down through generations. The smell of cinnamon and vanilla filled the air, and I could hear Angela moving around upstairs, probably trying to convince Tyler that 7 a.m. was still too early to wake up his sister. This kitchen had witnessed so much transformation. The formal dining room next door, once reserved for special occasions that grew increasingly rare, had been converted into Angela's study space when she'd started her master's degree in nursing education. The long table that had once seated 8 for holiday dinners now held textbooks and research papers, evidence of dreams being pursued and achieved. The changes weren't just physical. I had changed, too, in ways that went deeper than my daily routines or living arrangements. The woman who had once measured her worth by her family's need for her had learned to value herself based on her own choices and contributions. The woman who had waited for invitations had become someone who extended them. The woman who had defined herself through others' recognition had discovered her own sense of purpose and meaning. My volunteer work at the Literacy Center had expanded beyond anything I'd initially imagined. What had started as a few hours a week helping adults improve their reading skills had evolved into coordinating educational programs for the entire county. I'd written grants that brought in funding for new computers and learning materials. I'd trained other volunteers and developed curriculum that was being used by literacy centers in neighboring states. Last month, the state education department had honored me with their Volunteer Educator of the Year award, a recognition that meant more to me than any previous professional achievement because it represented work I'd chosen to do, not work I'd been obligated to perform. Angela and the children had attended the ceremony, cheering from the audience as I accepted the plaque that now hung in my hallway where family photos used to be. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd found my greatest professional success after retiring, that I'd made my most meaningful contributions to education after leaving the classroom, that I'd built my most authentic family relationships after being excluded from my biological family's gatherings. Angela's footsteps on the stairs interrupted my reflections, followed by the sound of children's voices as Madison and Tyler finally emerged from their bedrooms, drawn by the smell of breakfast and the promise of Christmas morning present opening. "Something smells amazing," Angela said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with her hair still damp from the shower and Tyler attached to her leg like a small pajama-clad barnacle. Madison followed more sedately, already dressed despite the early hour, her dark hair neatly braided and her face bright with the contained excitement of a 9-year-old who had learned that good things were worth waiting for properly. "Can we open presents after breakfast?" Tyler asked, though we all knew the answer. Our Christmas morning routine had been established through 2 years of practice, and Tyler asked the same question every year as if the answer might change. "After breakfast and after we get dressed," I confirmed, flipping another piece of French toast and adding it to the warming plate. "Good things come to those who follow the proper order of operations." Tyler groaned dramatically, but he was smiling. At 6, he'd learned that the anticipation was almost as much fun as the actual unwrapping, especially when it was accompanied by special breakfast and undivided attention from the adults he'd come to trust completely. As we sat around the kitchen table eating breakfast, I looked at these faces that had become as familiar and dear to me as my own reflection. Angela had grown more confident over the past 2 years, her success in nursing school, and now in her master's program giving her a sense of professional achievement that radiated into every aspect of her life. She'd bought a car last year, a reliable used sedan that represented independence and stability in ways that went far beyond transportation. Madison had blossomed into a voracious reader who tackled books that challenged her vocabulary and stretched her understanding of the world. She'd asked for a set of encyclopedias for Christmas, a request that had made me laugh with delight because it reminded me so much of my own childhood curiosity about everything and anything. Tyler had developed into a thoughtful, observant child whose questions often surprised adults with their depth and insight. He'd started reading fluently this year, a milestone we'd celebrated with a special dinner at his favorite restaurant and a trip to the bookstore where he'd been allowed to choose 10 books of his own. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in the house itself. What had once felt like a museum of past happiness had become a workshop for creating new joy. Every room showed evidence of lives being actively lived rather than carefully preserved. There were art supplies in the living room, musical instruments in the den, and science experiment materials scattered across the kitchen counter from Tyler's latest investigation into how crystals formed. After breakfast, we moved to the living room for present opening, a ritual that unfolded with the comfortable predictability of tradition but the spontaneous joy of genuine affection. Madison had made me a photo album documenting our adventures over the past year, with careful captions in her improving handwriting describing trips to the zoo, garden victories, and quiet moments of reading together on the porch swing. Tyler had created what he called the Best Grandma Ever certificate, complete with drawings of all his favorite activities we did together, and a gold star sticker that he'd applied with solemn ceremony. The title he'd given me made my heart swell with gratitude and recognition that family was indeed something you created rather than something you inherited. Angela's gift was practical and thoughtful, a beautiful leather-bound journal with my name embossed on the cover and a note inside encouraging me to write down the stories of my life, both for my own reflection and for future generations who might want to know about the woman who had helped raise Madison and Tyler. My gifts, to them, reflected the deep knowledge that comes from paying attention to the people you love. Madison received the encyclopedias she'd requested, along with a special reading chair for her bedroom, a cozy spot where she could curl up with her books. Tyler got a chemistry set appropriate for his age and curiosity level, along with a promise that we'd conduct experiments together every Saturday morning. For Angela, I'd arranged something that had taken months of planning and coordination with her academic advisor. A paid internship at the regional hospital's education department. An opportunity that would allow her to gain experience in nursing, education while still completing her master's degree. As she read the letter explaining the internship, Angela's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and disbelief. "Margaret, this is incredible," she said, using my first name in the way she did, during our most emotional moments. "How did you even know this was exactly what I hoped to do after graduation?" "I pay attention," I said simply. "And I believe in investing in people who are working hard to build better lives for themselves and their children." The truth was that I'd not only arranged the internship, but had quietly established a scholarship fund that would cover Angela's remaining tuition and expenses. She didn't need to know about that yet, perhaps not ever, but I wanted to ensure that financial stress wouldn't interfere with her educational goals. Later that afternoon, as we cleaned up the wrapping paper and prepared Christmas dinner together, the phone rang. The caller ID showed David's name, and for a moment, the familiar tightness returned to my chest. But it passed quickly, replaced by something closer to curiosity than anxiety. "Merry Christmas, Mom." David's voice was warm, but tentative, the tone of someone who wasn't sure of his reception. "Merry Christmas, David. How are you and the family?" We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things, the weather, the children's school activities, his work projects. But then David's voice changed, became more personal. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about the last few years, about how things changed between us. I realize now that we made some mistakes, that we hurt you in ways we didn't understand at the time." I listened without interrupting, aware that Madison and Tyler were playing quietly in the next room while Angela prepared vegetables for our dinner. This conversation belonged to my past while my present continued around me, unaffected by whatever David might say. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied when he finished. "I hope you and Jennifer have found happiness in the choices you've made." "We have, mostly. But we miss you, Mom. The kids ask about you sometimes, wonder why they don't see Grandma Margaret anymore." The words might have broken my heart 2 years ago, might have sent me rushing back into relationships that had already proven their capacity to wound me. But now they simply made me sad for what had been lost and grateful for what had been found. "I hope they're doing well," I said genuinely. "Children grow so fast. I'm sure they're turning into wonderful young people." "They are. But Mom, I was wondering if maybe we could try to spend some time together again. Not to go back to the way things were, but to build something new. Jennifer and I have both done some growing up, I think." I looked through the kitchen doorway at Tyler, who was showing Madison how to make paper airplanes with the Christmas wrapping paper, and at Angela, who was humming quietly as she worked at the stove. This was my family now, these people who had chosen me as I had chosen them, who demonstrated their love through daily kindness rather than holiday obligations. "I'm glad you've both grown," I said to David. "That's what people should do as they get older. But I've grown too, and my life has taken a different direction. I have responsibilities now, people who depend on me, commitments I've made." "Oh." David sounded surprised, as if he'd expected to find me sitting in my empty house, unchanged and waiting for his invitation to resume my former role. "I volunteer extensively with adult literacy programs," I explained, "and I'm helping to raise 2 children whose mother is finishing her master's degree in nursing. My days are quite full." The silence that followed was complicated, filled with things neither of us was prepared to say directly. I wasn't angry at David anymore, wasn't hurt by his long-ago choices, but I also wasn't available to be reintegrated into his life at his convenience. "Well," he said finally, "maybe we could meet for lunch sometime, when your schedule allows." "Maybe," I agreed. though we both probably understood that maybe meant probably not. After we hung up, I stood for a moment in my kitchen, processing the conversation and my reaction to it. 2 years ago, David's call would have felt like salvation, like the answer to prayers I'd been afraid to voice. Today, it felt like an interruption, a reminder of a chapter in my life that had ended not with bitterness, but with acceptance and growth. Angela appeared beside me, reading my expression with the intuitive understanding that had developed between us over months of shared daily life. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. "Everything's perfect," I said, and meant it completely. That evening, after dinner, and after the children had reluctantly agreed to go to bed despite their Christmas excitement, Angela and I sat in the living room with glasses of wine, watching the lights twinkle on the tree that Tyler had insisted we decorate with handmade ornaments this year. "Do you ever regret it?" Angela asked suddenly. "The way things worked out with your family, I mean. Do you ever wish you could go back to the way things were before?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman I'd been 2 years ago and the woman I'd become. The Margaret who had received that devastating voicemail had been someone who defined herself entirely through other people's needs and approval, someone who had never learned to distinguish between being useful and being valued. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret any of it. Even the painful parts led me to this, to you and Madison and Tyler, to work that matters, to understanding that family is something you create through love and choice, rather than something you inherit through biology and obligation." Angela reached over and squeezed my hand, a gesture of affection that had become natural between us over the past 2 years. "You saved us," she said softly. "When I was struggling as a single mother, working dead-end jobs and worrying about my children's future, you gave us stability and love and hope for something better. You saved me too," I replied. "You reminded me that I still had something valuable to offer the world, that my life wasn't over just because one chapter had ended badly." As we sat in comfortable silence, I thought about the letter I'd written and sealed in an envelope that was locked in my safe, to be opened only after my death. It was addressed to David and Jennifer, not with anger or recrimination, but with forgiveness and explanation. I wanted them to understand that my choices had been motivated by love rather than spite, by hope rather than bitterness. The letter explained my new will, which left everything to Angela and her children with the exception of modest educational funds for my biological grandchildren. I'd written about the joy I'd found in my chosen family, the meaning I'd discovered in my volunteer work, the peace that had come from learning to value myself based on my own standards rather than other people's recognition. But that was a conversation for the future, perhaps the distant future. Tonight was about presence rather than legacy, about the warmth of the house around us and the comfort of knowing that tomorrow would bring more opportunities to love and be loved by people who had proven their commitment through years of daily kindness. As I prepared for bed that night, I stopped in the doorway of Madison's room to check on her one last time. She was sleeping peacefully, her new book open beside her on the pillow, her face relaxed in the way that only comes to children, who feel completely secure in their world. Tyler's room was next, where he slept surrounded by the products of our various experiments and building projects, evidence of curiosity encouraged and questions answered with patience and enthusiasm. And finally, I paused outside Angela's door, hearing the soft sound of pages turning as she studied for her upcoming exams, pursuing dreams that our little family had made possible through shared resources and mutual support. This was what family actually looked like, I realized. Not the formal gatherings and obligatory phone calls I'd once thought were love, but the daily choice to show up for each other, to invest in each other's growth, to create a home where everyone felt valued and supported. Standing in the hallway of the house I'd once thought of as a monument to past happiness, I felt profound gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought me to this moment. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the doorway to the best thing that could happen to you. And sometimes losing the family you thought you needed leads you to finding the family you actually deserve. The Christmas lights outside my bedroom window twinkled against the darkness, and I fell asleep feeling completely content with the life I'd built from the ashes of the life that had been taken away. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to teach and learn, to love and be loved, to continue writing the story of a woman who had learned that it's never too late to choose happiness over obligation, authenticity over appearance, chosen family over biological family. In the morning, there would be pancakes to make and children to hug, and another day of the beautiful, ordinary life I'd discovered was possible when you stopped waiting for other people to write your story and picked up the pen yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.